Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. So we are going to be talking about defense mechanisms, and we're going to try to break it down to help you understand what are defense mechanisms, when do they show up, what do they mean, and how do we navigate them as parents. So today we have Jocelyn Pulver, who is a licensed practicing counselor, and she's going to break down these topics for us to help us understand how they impact us in our parenting.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce, for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about defense mechanisms, but before we get to that, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been thinking about what is important for you to know about me, but basically, I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Idaho. I have been working to basically get to this place of helping people for a really long time. I have a pretty extensive history of my own, and I'm hoping to come out with a book, which is really exciting, to kind of give some background as to how I ended up doing that. But basically, the main groups of people that I help are people that have a history of trauma, specifically more like complex trauma. So something that somebody has experienced over a period of time repeatedly, as opposed to somebody, say, for example, that maybe got in a car accident. And not that I don't help those people, but just there's a special group of people that, have been through some more traumatic, extensive things. And also other things that fall into that too, like depression and anxiety, and some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today with defense mechanisms and how that shows up in families, in our relationships, and most important relationship, the one that we have with ourselves. So I'm from Idaho, and I love to travel. I love river rafting, writing, reading, just basically doing anything outdoors and creative. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Okay, so when we're talking about defense mechanisms, what does that really mean?
So it's kind of interesting, right? Most people would say that defense mechanisms fall underneath this unconscious space, but actually it is something that we can become consciously aware of. And basically what they are these patterns or behaviors that pop up and kind of like show their ugly head sometimes when we're in these difficult situations. And there's so many different kinds, and we actually are going to get to breaking down some of them individually here, but without getting into that, I would like you to think about it as more along the unconscious lines of our patterns and behavior that we can become conscious of and how we relate to people in stressful times.
Yeah. It's really about the stress, right? Like it's maybe not necessarily in our like best light where we're functioning, right? Like in our best, like we've got everything going right. That's not normally where these defense mechanisms come up because they're trying to protect, right? I think, and sometimes they don't protect maybe in the most helpful way, but their goal might be to protect us. So are they good or are they bad? And why do we have them?
Yeah, you said something interesting there too. And I was wanting to touch on this because, yes, are they good? Are they bad? It depends. It depends how we're looking at it, right? Somebody could be like, well, I don't really like the way that you do this, or this is harmful or hurtful. But these are just behaviors that we've learned. And so when I'm working with my clients, I really try to, unless somebody is being harmed or we're harming ourselves, which, it's relative, right? Because, okay, are you talking about like physically harming somebody, emotionally, right? Spiritually, mentally. So there's kind of there's layers here. So we have to be able to kind of step back and ask ourselves, is this abusive? In some cases, the answer is going to be yes. In other cases, we might say, It's borderline. It could be that, but is the person actively working to address whatever the situation may be? And so then in that case, yes, it could borderline on the sense of abusive or bad, right? But
Mm-hmm.
if a person is actively trying to address whatever the situation or the behavior might be, the defense mechanism, then we have to give people the benefit of the doubt that at least they're trying. So I don't know if we would like really say good or bad. We just want to look at the behavior. We want to look at what are the consequences that are showing up.
Mm-hmm.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think, yeah, because they can play both roles, right? Of like, they're maybe not outrightly good or outrightly bad. It's just like what you do with them, like how it plays out, right? And what your
Mhm.
awareness is to them. And as people can certainly
Well,
use behaviors to hurt people on purpose, right? Or hurt
mhm.
people unintentionally, right? Not without having awareness to that.
And I think you mentioned something that's really, I mean, crucial there, right? Is like, what is the purpose behind it? What is somebody, and this is where the unconscious and conscious plays in, right? Is a person aware that they're actually trying to get something either from someone or from themselves, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you can, and when that goes back to that protecting, I think you said we're protecting ourselves, but also people will very much, especially parents, right? Very much try to protect their kin. And
Yeah.
sometimes that can be good, but other times it can be detrimental too. So
Yeah.
what is that purpose, right? What is the purpose
Mm-hmm.
behind the behavior, behind the action? And is it helpful or is it harmful?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
let's step back and define what is conscious versus unconscious, because some people may not know the difference in our mind of those layers.
Yeah, that's a great question and something that I'm still learning myself, quite frankly.
Sure.
Um, but the way that I think about it or understand it is conscious is something that's going to be we're aware of it. We understand that we're noticing that there's certain behaviors in ourselves or another person. We're like, ooh, I noticed that um when I ask you about your day, you get kind of like you get kind of tense, you get kind of agitated with me, and I'm wondering what that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh, so unconscious, you're aware of it, you see these little patterns, maybe you're not fully understanding where it's coming from or what it is, but that's that growing awareness, that's that growing consciousness. And so with that comes curiosity, right, and an openness to kind of unpack what may be there. And sometimes that's
Mm-hmm.
a little scary for people, right? Because sometimes when we start to unpack those things, we don't like what we necessarily find. Um,
Sure.
Unconscious is going to be the opposite of that, right? We're not aware. We don't see the patterns. We don't see the behavior. We don't have a sense of curiosity. And really, like we could probably argue that we're we're not interested in really knowing, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
curiosity part where, and so that's where we get into, okay, what are the different types that we see there, such as denial, for example, because we don't want to see what's there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really interesting. I just have to like mention that too, is because so if if we have this inclination of denial, right? We don't want to know it's there, then there's
Mm-hmm.
there's that piece that says, okay, question. So there's something inside said person that realizes something is there because we wouldn't be able to have the denial. So that unconsciousness, again, I don't want to think in black and white terms, like you're just fully unconscious and not there or fully conscious. There's a big gray area and we're working in
Mm-hmm.
percentages here.
Yeah, well, and I think we can like vacillate between those two layers of our awareness, right? Like you could be totally aware of something, totally conscious that something's happening, and then kind of push that away and then, be into a place where you don't see it, which is kind of denial. But I think we can vacillate. We it's not like you're just in one way. Like people awaken and then they're always everything's in their consciousness. I mean, that's not true because I know that studied psychology for so many years. I don't even know. I've been in private practice for like 15 years. And so before that, I went to school for a long time too. So I mean, but it's still, like there are times where it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even see that. Like, holy smokes. Like it took me a while to put those pieces together. And then I'm like, oh, okay. Like this is all falling into place. But before that, I just was, I don't know, not always pleasantly unaware, but just like unaware, just not putting all the pieces together, right?
Yeah, not always pleasantly unaware. Sometimes though, maybe.
Yeah, sometimes it is nice to just be like, you're just here, right? Like you're just that, right? Like that's just who you are. But
Yeah.
I don't know that that always plays a valuable role. So it's helpful to know what consciousness versus unconsciousness is. And we won't get into our subconsciousness, but that's kind of a middle ground. But these are for this conversation, we'll keep in conscious and unconscious. Okay, so let's talk about some of the common defenses that we have and what they look like. Because I think, even like some of the stuff I think about, like I remember when I studied for my boards, it's like you bring all these things back into your mind because you're like, oh man, I haven't thought of that defense mechanism in a while. And some of them are confusing even for us, I think, where it's like, okay, what does that really, really mean? And so we're going to try the best we can to break down some of the most common defense mechanisms that people have. But you started talking about denial. Do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I just have to mention too that, I mean, you're so right when it comes to just ourselves, right? That like I'll be the first to say that, as I wrote down just a few lists of the ones that I want to mention because they're the most common ones that I see. But I'm like, oh, I do that.
Yeah,
Which is why
totally.
it's important for us as therapists, counselors, just people that are there to serve and help to also be honest with ourselves that, hey, we also benefit from this work too. Right.
Mhm.
So I just want to put that out there. Like I by no means have these 100% down, but I definitely learn as I go. And just by,
Mhm.
sitting in and watching a talk like this, I can't tell you how many I've sat in and watched and studied for years and years and years, and I'm still learning. Right.
Absolutely.
So yeah, denial. Where do we want to start with that one? So yeah, the way that I understand denial is basically, I'm trying to think of an example. So when I'm in sessions, I a lot of times will use analogies, and sometimes they come to me really easy, and other times like it's too
Sure.
forced, right?
Hmm.
So the way that I understand it basically is refusing to accept the reality or fact of a
Hmm.
situation, right?
Yeah.
We don't want, for whatever reason, we don't want to see what's in front of us, right? It's not
Hmm.
aligning with our ideal reality of what we hoped or thought it may be, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah, well, I was going to give an example of that. A lot of them are coming to my mind. So one can be in domestic violence situations, right? So it's like where they see the person that they love, right, is treating them in a certain way, right? And other people will be saying to them, "Hey, you know, this doesn't seem like a healthy place. Are you okay? Are you safe? I don't think you got that bruise from that," or, feeling these different feelings, right? And trying to protect us. Or even teenagers saying to their friends, like, oh, I don't think you should date him. He's kind of a jerk, right? And they're like, no, he's so sweet. He's so nice. He's the best, right? Like, I love him so much. And so like those can be examples, or like when parents, their kids do something. And I grew up in a guilty until you're proven innocent family, but some people grow up in innocent until proven guilty families. And so then their parents would defend them, right? Even sometimes they start recognizing like, oh, I think my kid actually did this, but they're still defending that part because they don't accept the reality that their kid could have hurt another kid on purpose, or their kid, stole something or whatever it is, right? Some behavior that they are not proud of, that they would be like, my kid would never do that.
yeah, all those are so good and so true. And it's just it's sad, right, for the individual that is going through that, because again, it's, there's something that, and it's so specific to the individual, but there's a
Sure.
loss, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
part of that person, or their imagination of what they hoped it would be, that they have to face reality and just say, and again, we have to look, sure, there's potential that person could potentially change. They could show up as that person that you hoped and wanted them to be, but we have to look at what's in front of us. And sometimes that's really hard,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's your child, right? Because
Yeah.
you're their person, you're their caretaker, you got their back. But
Mm-hmm.
we actually see that when parents aren't there, well, let's put it this way, when they're playing friend, right, as opposed to parent,
Mm-hmm.
they so much more damage is done long term.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I can't tell you time and time again how many kids I work with that exact same situation that end up in juvie, end up in prison later in life, because their kid was doing something that wasn't good, wasn't okay,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the parent really needed to be their parent and not their friend, and they didn't. And the behaviors, the consequences just spiraled out of control, and
Yeah.
yeah, led to a bad
Yeah,
situation.
absolutely.
Now
It can be really
that's a lot
hard.
of
Yes, I was just thinking that, like, yeah, if you're not accepting the reality of your kid, stealing, right? And you're like,
Mhm.
okay, they're not going to do it again. They said they wouldn't do it again, or vaping or something like that, where they're just like, I'm not going to do it. And then you're like, okay, they said that, so I believe that. And I'm not saying don't believe your kids, but also be conscious, right? Of, okay, so if we're saying we're not going to vape anymore, tell me how, why? Like, let's get some more data, because that would be something that just hard to just stop, right? The research
Mhm.
says it's really hard to do. Or if you steal something, like, there's probably a reason, like, what's behind the behavior? Like, let's get down to the root of the issue instead of just accepting the word. Like, okay, why were we vaping? Why did we steal? Trying to figure
Mhm.
out those pieces. But it's hard to do that when you're the friend and not the parent,
Mhm.
because friends don't
Well,
really
and
talk
sometimes,
about that.
right. That's exactly it. It's like, and it's just hard to do it as a parent. And so that's where extra support can be really
Hmm.
helpful, to finding somebody that either they can trust and they can talk to about, or even better, especially for kids, is somebody that they admire, that
Yeah.
is a good influence for them, right?
Yeah,
So that
totally.
they listen, right? But if they don't
Hmm.
have that, if they don't have a good influence or somebody that they look up to and respect, that's outside of the parental realm.
Hmm.
And I have to mention too, it's like, if the parent does have that ability, they have that strong relationship, great, go for it. But if you're noticing some conflict, that might be a good time to look outside the
Hmm.
unit, right, for that
Yeah, which
person.
is healthy, because I think, when we look historically, we raise our kids in communities, right? The parent was not the only support people or person. It was grandparents lived with you, aunts and uncles lived in your, like, next door, your cousins were there, right? Like, everybody was kind of joining in to raise children. And it wasn't just like one parent or two parents to one family, it was a community. So I think just to support that idea of, like, it's good to have other people in your community. It's good to have your kids have other people to talk to and not just you, because sometimes they need different things. And as parents, I am not going to be everything my kid needs. I'm not. I mean, it doesn't matter how great of a mom I am. I am not going to be all the things. So we need other people to have strengths where my weaknesses are. And that's good and okay.
Hmm. Yeah, and this goes off on a different topic, so I'll just briefly touch on this. But it's interesting though, because in today's age, there's a lot of breakdown of families, right? Whether it's because of people not being able to get along and work through challenging times, and so the families just kind of like, they don't stay together. Or the other thing that's also becoming more prevalent in societies is moving, right? People
Mm-hmm.
going and so and we don't have to necessarily look at that as a bad thing, but just being aware of that fact and also being open and creative to forming communities and what that looks like if it's not a direct family. And sometimes people don't have family, right? And so just
Yeah,
there's other ways. So mhm.
absolutely. Okay, so we got denial down, I think. What's our next
Oh,
defense
okay. What's the next
mechanism?
one we have here? So the next one I have written down is repression.
Yes.
So this one's really interesting. So this is when, so say for example, this is classic trauma, right? So kind of my specialty. Um, you had a terrible thing happen either to you or to one of your family members or between a family member, child, and you don't want to remember it, right? So you push it down into the recesses of your consciousness, the recesses of your mind, and um, you basically just try to forget it, right? So how does that look different from denial? I would say the two are almost related in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
but repression, I would say, is I'm a visual person, so something that's like further down into the recesses of your mind. Whereas denial, it's kind of like it's still close enough to the surface where it's like if you really pay attention, like maybe somatically to how you feel, you would probably start to feel a bit guilty or maybe even shame sometimes, even though we don't like
Mm-hmm.
to put that out there. But yeah, whereas repression is it's much deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be harder to access or even realize that behavior is there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it seems lower down, like you said, like deeper in, where it's like if somebody said like, let's say there was domestic violence in your home growing up, and people would be like, were your parents, did you ever experience domestic violence? You'd be like, no. It's not about not wanting it to be true. It's just that it feels like it is not true, even though it
Mm,
is there. I think for me, that's kind of like, and what tends to cause that to bubble up, it seems, is something else happens that kind of triggers that. And you have an awareness that, like, all these things, it's almost like you had amnesia, like you just totally blocked it out. And then things start coming and you're like, this can't be real. Those things
mm,
tend to be the things that are repressed, that you start remembering pictures, right? Especially when we're young, of those things. And you're like, oh, this is real. And then you can sometimes fact check with people like, did this happen? And sometimes you
right.
can't because, sometimes by the time those things do come up, the people that might be your fact checking people have passed away or, are no longer in contact to get that information.
Right. Yeah, I have an example that kind of just came up for me, and it's been something that's I've been seeing with families. But for example, say you have somebody that they experienced bullying when they were a
Mm-hmm.
child, and now they have kids, and their kids, whether it's amongst their own kids or kids in the school system, are now bullying each other, or the parent is now witnessing that. That can be a trigger for that parent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they haven't processed their own trauma from the time when they were a child and
Mm-hmm.
experiencing that bullying. So that person, if they hadn't processed it, they likely repressed those memories because they were disturbing, because they don't want to remember them, because
Mm-hmm.
it made them feel uncomfortable, angry, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now is being brought up. And I mean, I would imagine if you're seeing it amongst your own children doing it to each other, like that's probably even more disturbing for some people sometimes because you're like, my own kin is doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
hate bullying. I hate that. And so
Mm-hmm.
that actually kind of leads me into another one that comes up, which is the projection,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we can actually begin to project the said feelings, thoughts that we felt about the bullying that happened now can be projected onto our children, right? That, oh, however you might have felt about bullies or a specific bully in general, right? So, and that's,
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to feel that way about children, right? We don't want to feel that way
Yeah.
about our children specifically.
Mm-hmm. hmm Well, and I've definitely seen it where that projection has been like an experience a kid has had or a teen has had, and then they're projecting the feelings that they have for that frenemy, right, to their parent, right? And that can cause conflict where the parent's like, what is going on here? Right? Like I'm not even involved in this. And sometimes with projection, people can lead you down the path of like, do you think that maybe this might be connected to this? So there sometimes can be an awareness to that part, but it's just, blame or association or thoughts that are about somebody else that are projected onto another person. And sometimes it can be yourself. Like you might own something, right? That
Mhm.
is not really about you and it's about something else. So they can get
Mhm.
complicated, but projection can be,
Complicated.
yeah, and super common of like where I feel like, especially in my practice, I see, like that kid teen dynamic or like you were talking about parents assigning kind of fears to their kids, like projecting a reality that's not really there because they're afraid, right?
Because they're afraid, right?
Yeah.
Well, and let me go back and just add a few more comments to that is with the projection, or you mentioned these are complex topics. So you see me pausing, good. We just collect our thoughts together.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. This is
But
good.
yeah, so imagine you have a child that did go through a traumatic time to where they were super confused about what happened. Maybe they weren't old enough to fully process certain things. Maybe their memory is a little bit blank. And this could be you, right? This could be the parent, this could be the
Hmm
child. But the point that I want to make here is that these associations that can be made are not always rational, right?
hmm
Because, and I think that's really important that we name that, because a lot of times when I'm working with people, they want to rationalize things, right? Because, well, they're trying to make sense of their situation. And
hmm
if it's not rational, if it doesn't make sense, then they must not have landed on it quite yet. But, and this can happen with adult people as well. So it's not
hmm
just, from childhood to adult, but I do want to mention that it's like as from childhood, it's more likely for that rationalization to not fully be there. Well, obvious because they're a child, right? Their brain is
hmm
not developed fully. So
Yeah.
we want to just at least know that that's there, and give ourselves some grace, give each other grace, and realize that, okay, if I, say a person was sexually abused as a child and they grow up and they think that they're not worthy. They don't think they're enough, right?
hmm
But they're like, well, that's stupid. Like, why would I ever think that? Because it was that person's fault, not mine. But
hmm
when, for example, say this person starts to go and get into relationships and they find themselves in abusive relationship after abusive relationship, well, that's probably a clear indicator that somewhere in the unconscious or subconscious mind that they have internalized that belief, whether they realize it or not.
hmm
Right. And so, and then, if we take that a step further, right, into something like projection, um, we have to also realize, and I think you mentioned this too, is that we can project that onto ourselves, right?
hmm
Even though it's coming from something in the past and it doesn't seem rational that we would project our unworthiness from something someone did to us onto self,
hmm
um, because it's not rational. That's where the subconscious, unconscious, and bringing it into the conscious really comes into play to realize, okay, what do I actually believe? How do I actually feel about myself? And is my life experiences and the relationships that I have, child, partner, etc., is it showing the fruits of how I feel about myself, or is it showing something different? And then that's where
hmm
the call for inner work comes in.
Yeah. Which I think, again, you said this earlier, the inner work piece is so hard sometimes. Like we don't really want to unpack it because if you open it, it's like you can't get it back in. It never fits quite right. You can't forget what you've brought awareness to. But I think that's where unlocking that piece of like finding true happiness, right? Like where we're able to like really feel it and peace and calmness. I think, when I think about like the emotion that I really want in life, oftentimes people are like happiness. I'm like, I just want peace. I just want calm. Like happy is
Mhm.
great, but I don't even need it up that high, right? Like I'm just like, just this, right? Like that feels good. But that's so different than where I was when I was younger, but that made me think of that. So, okay. So what defense mechanism are we on to next?
Yeah. So let's see. Displacement is the next one that I have written down here. So this is where, so say you don't have such a, like maybe the relationship that you have with your partner is, we keep using domestic violence is a big one that comes to mind, but it's like so extreme, I think sometimes that it's like, it's useful to use
Yeah.
that because it's like,
It's
oh,
easier to
okay.
see. Yeah. Yeah.
Your distinction, right? But yeah, say the relationship you have with your partner is unsafe, that, and you might say you're upset with them for something. Instead of approaching them about it, you might displace that anger towards your child.
Mm-hmm.
So, your partner isn't helping out around the house and you feel like everything's falling on you. Instead of going to your partner who's supposed to be your partner to help, right? You might get angry with your children and take it out on them that they're being lazy or ungrateful or whatever have you. And there's an appropriate amount of guidance that children need to help out, especially if they're of age and to be a part of the family. But it's how we approach them and use that guidance to get them involved in
Mm-hmm.
helping, right? As opposed to just so pretty different.
Yeah. Yeah, totally different. I mean, I think when you need your kids' help, you're like, hey, I need help with unloading the dishwasher, right? Like, or I could use your help with bringing your laundry down, or, right? I think, sometimes just jumping into that, our kids, if you haven't done that before, might be like, no way, or just like ignore you. But I mean, I think we can ask, right? And it's also like, what's the objective? Is that really the problem? Is bringing down the laundry, helping unload the dishwasher going to solve the real issue that we're having, or is it really something else? And if it's that, right, having your kids help around, great. But if it's really about a conflict with somebody else, and I know sometimes like I might have a stressful day at work and then come home and it can feel like I'm just kind of like irritated, right? And that would be this feeling that we're talking about displacement, right? Like putting it on the wrong person. Um,
Mhm.
and so then it's like, I quickly normally realize that I'm like, I'm grumpy. I need to go for a walk, or like I need some moments to myself to collect myself. I'm going to sit in the car for a few extra minutes, right? Like I'm able to like be aware of that. So it's in my consciousness. Maybe not initially, because sometimes I might be like grouchy and then be like, oh, wait, hold on. That has nothing to do with you. So sorry. Like,
Yeah.
let me fix that. But I think we can all be susceptible to this where we have something that happens that causes a feeling. And then instead of navigating it within that system because of whatever reason, right, then we choose to try to balance it in another place, but that doesn't actually create balance.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like you said, just looking to see like what is the reason, what is the cause? And I would say it's probably a mix of different things usually, right? But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's very glaringly a bit like there's one thing that's like the elephant in the room that maybe needs to be
Sure.
addressed more so than just getting upset and putting it over here.
Sure. Yes. Yes. Yeah. It can be definitely bigger than that too. Okay. What do we have next?
Rationalization. So, this one I wrote down is it's when we want to justify our behavior and create some sort of logical reason when really there needs to be an accountability piece there,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So yeah, we want to rationalize, that, oh, we got angry because, I had a hard day at work or I'm on my period. How many
Mm-hmm.
times have you heard that one, right? Where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, you're kind of always just like this. Like you come
Mm-hmm.
home and you dump your day on everybody, or you say it's just this time of the month, but it seems to be like more often than not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of taking accountability and digging a little deeper, being like, okay, the people around you are saying that they're seeing something. Maybe we need to look into that instead of
Mm-hmm.
ignoring it.
Yeah. Well, and my kids can sometimes do this where they'll be like, well, I only did this because they did this. And I get that this might be deeper stuff, but it's like we can definitely rationalize what we do, be
I love
in
that,
kind of
kid.
right, where it's like, well, it's not my fault because I would never have done that if they wouldn't have stole a piece of candy first. I mean, it wasn't my idea. I just did it because they also did it. So like it needed to be fair. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but like, no,
Yeah.
not going to work for me.
That's not, and really just at that point, I think that, yes, I see older people, sometimes really older people kind of still using that justification
Mhm.
system, which is like, okay, y'all, like, but compassion, right? If we can teach kids early on how to communicate
Mhm.
what their what their real intentions are, and okay, why do they feel the need to either make excuses or lie to
Mhm.
justify their point, or place the blame in that situation elsewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it can be hard. And I think it amplifies the value in like teaching our kids their emotions, having them talk about them, right? Because if we're able to say like, hey, I took this piece of candy, then it's like, okay. And
Okay.
it's like,
Yeah.
what was going on? Well, I mean, it was there and I really wanted it, right? And I was afraid that everybody else was going to eat all of them and I wasn't going to get one, so I just ate it. It's like, okay,
Mm.
right? Like, I mean, when my kids come and they have a valid point, I'll be like, okay, well, that was your dessert, like you just had it before dinner or whatever. Like that might be my reflection. I'm not super huge on tons of consequences, but I'm like, that just seems like a natural consequence. You just had your dessert first. Okay. But
And also engaging kids in so I when I work with clients, I definitely talk about consequences because there's things that I feel like should
yeah,
definitely have consequences. But I try to use the language consequences versus punishment,
yeah.
um, especially corporal punishment. But the one of the things that I try to instill working with children and parents is to get the other person involved. So in this case, it would be
Mhm.
the child. So, okay, well, how should we work on this together? Because the reason that I had that rule in place is because I wanted to save some candy for this event, or I want to make sure that we're not overindulging too much because too much candy is not a good thing. So, do you think that you could help me figure out a way that we could make this so it's not so tempting for you next time, or just getting them thinking and being creative and making them part of that process, because they're so much more likely to want to be a part of it if they feel like they have a say in the process.
Mhm.
And it also helps them learn how to set rules for themselves, right? Because
Yeah.
we're not always going to be around to help guide that. They need to figure out how to do that as well. And what a perfect way then to help with that, right?
Yeah. To model that.
And actually,
Fantastic.
there's some research on that says kids will actually, not always, but they will actually go for more punishment or like harsher punishment than less, which I
Oh
found
yeah.
really interesting.
My kids are a
Um,
perfect example of that. They definitely pick. I'm like, are you sure you want that consequence? Like that seems pretty steep. Like, but then it gives me an opportunity to like talk through it. But yeah, totally. I agree.
okay, cool.
one of the other defense mechanisms that I was thinking about is sometimes our kids will act out, right? So they'll perform some type of action that we would consider bad, right? In order to get attention. And sometimes they don't recognize that they're doing it. Do you ever see that in your practice?
Yeah. So I get kind of curious about that. Like what kind of, so are we just talking about like kind of regressing into previous states, like more childish behaviors that we see?
Well, I think the definition that I know is previous states, like you're able to handle that, right? Like it's not something that you're learning now, but you previously could, let's see, like potty train, I guess. I don't know if that would be an acting out part, but like maybe like peeing your pants on purpose would be something where it's like that.
Yeah.
That's a hard one. But I think sometimes I see kids regress in their behaviors in order to get attention. Do you think that
Yeah.
happens?
Yeah. Yeah. That is an interesting one. Well, and we can look at adults in that sense too, right? That you put them into a challenging situation and they might throw a tantrum, right? Because well, maybe they didn't learn the skills that were needed to address the situation, or maybe they're looking for attention and that was the way that they were able to get attention, right? So somebody that throws a tantrum, maybe they experienced a lot of neglect, right? So and that's not to say, for example, that like a child peeing their pants is them being neglected, but we have to go back to rationalizing, because children, our idea, as adults of rationalization is very different. So what I mean by that is you might not think that you're neglecting them, or you might not think that you're not showing them enough attention, but they might feel like they're not getting enough attention, and thus they may feel that they're being neglected.
Yeah, it can get tricky for sure. So how can these defense mechanisms show up in our relationships with our children, either on our behalf or on our kids' behalf?
Oh man, I feel like we've just been talking about that, right?
Yeah.
These relationships. Well, I think just like really basic, I think it can create a lot of tension in the beginning, especially for new parents, right? But for new parents, or even just as the child is continuing through their evolutionary states. But if a child and parent, or adolescent and parent, can work together and stay committed to finding peace, using communication, navigating what conflicts do arise, and trying to learn the skills that show up with that, either with professional help or, seeking support from other family members, then ultimately the ideal, right, is that the family can learn how to communicate, how to resolve and repair. It's very possible, but I think that the key component there is consistency, because it's not something that just is learned overnight. And very much, I mean, we look at a lot of adults, there's so many skills that are still being learned throughout adulthood and beyond. So if we're still learning it, then there really needs to be compassion for the younger generations that are being brought up in the world today.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when there's a lot of outside influence that can create some complex situations.
For sure. Yeah. So how do we keep our defenses at bay? So obviously we know like talking through them, being open, being compassionate is helpful, but what if our defenses do come up for ourselves or our kids? How do we navigate that?
I'm of the, maybe this is a belief system, I don't know, you can check me on this, but I'm of the belief that so often I feel like there's so much, what's the word? What's this motion? where people repress, or constrict. There's a lot of constriction in our world. You have to act this way. You have to be this way. You have to look this way. That I think a lot of people in general are very stifled, right? And so if you want to keep it at bay, we first need to acknowledge that it's there. And then we need to be able to work through it openly in a safe place. So I don't think that it's something that we just do, like almost like a force. I think it's something that happens. It happens naturally over time. So just like, they say, oh, you can't force love. It's something that blooms. It's something that just happens, right? That's how I think about it too. And so that's where the compassion and the consistency and the understanding that needs to come in is that this is going to be hard, and it's probably going to trigger things in you and in me, and we're not going to like each other all the time, but that's okay. That's part of this process of learning and growing and eventually getting to a place where we understand each other because we've been able to work through these things and not suppress them or stifle them to where it's gonna pop its ugly head in a place where we're not safe, in a place where somebody doesn't understand us, and in a place where somebody doesn't unconditionally love us, right? So the home is really where we have this great opportunity to learn and to embody those characteristics that we really want, and then go out into the world and be that shining example and, help others that maybe didn't get that same opportunity.
So really it's about the parents being educated, like knowing about these things, right? Like understanding that these defense mechanisms are present in all of us or have the capacity to show up, and then acknowledging that they can happen and then helping our kids navigate through those pieces. Is that what I heard you say?
I think the education piece is like the ideal, right? Because you don't have to come in here like fully educated. It's the desire to want a relationship, a relationship with your family, something that not something that's forced, that you just, just that you really want that connection. That's the first thing. And then the follow through with, reaching out for support, getting help for your kids, getting help for yourself, being okay with the breakdown so that you can build it up into something that's, the ideal of what you're looking for. And through all of that, that's the whole thing is one big piece of education, but you don't have to come in and just, that's a part of it. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think, and sometimes it's just acknowledging that we do all have ways that we're trying to just protect ourselves, right? Whether they're helpful or unhelpful. Like it makes sense. Like, when kids lie, parents will ask me like, my kid lies to me, right? And it's like, okay, what's the purpose? Why are we doing that? And when we can figure out where that is, then we can help resolve that. So maybe it's about how we respond, right? Maybe it's about how they perceive something. So I think it's about the curiosity piece too, of just being curious about where our kids are or where we are, right? And having compassion with ourselves too, because oftentimes as parents, that's a hard piece. Okay, so what do you want parents to take away from this conversation? I know this has been a deeper conversation with lots of nuances, but still very important.
Yeah. And honestly, like if this was my first time really getting into some of this stuff, I probably would even go back and watch it 2 or 3 times because there's so many little pieces that it's like, okay, she didn't even make sense. And maybe I did it, so.
No, you did. You made sense. Yes. Yeah.
Some humor there, but yeah, I think, gosh, Bryce, you just said so many amazing things there in that last little bit that such great takeaways just right there. But gosh, there's so many different things, but I think for me, things that have been really important for me on my own journey are just to stay open, especially when you're feeling angry, upset, maybe you feel like somebody's betrayed you, you're lacking trust, any of these things that come up, they're an invitation to go deeper, right? So instead of putting unless somebody is like outright just like there's abuse, right? Then that's a very different situation. But if there's just a lot of emotions and there's miscommunication and confusion. Again, this is an invitation to go deeper, to not always take things personally, right? To kind of consider that like maybe this person has something else going on that I can't even begin to see. And what is my part in that? Right? A lot of this inner work is really about getting to know ourselves, right? And how we show up in relationship. And where are the aspects of ourself getting caught in self-preservation, right? That we're trying to protect ourselves, we're trying to protect our family members. We need to release that control and trust, have some faith. Get the kiddos involved. Ask them how they want to do this. Get your partner involved. And if they don't want to get involved, then you keep working on yourself. Because as you keep working on yourself, things around you, the people around you will notice, and it will start to change. Sometimes it's really slow, so that's where the consistency is going to need to come in. But if you're consistent, your environment will change. Sometimes in ways that we're not expecting, but trust me when I say that as long as you're doing the good work, it's going to result in good change.
Yeah, so, yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Bryce. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for ending at this 2:00. I really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks again, Jocelyn. That was all really good information. I know this was a lot to download today, so I appreciate you sticking with us. I would love it if you'd go back and re-listen to this episode, because I think we did download a lot of complex information, and hopefully you made it into a tangible bites for you to understand how these defense mechanisms can show up. But I think, it starts with us understanding ourselves, having self-compassion, having self-love, being curious about this internal journey that we're doing. And this may just be the purpose of life, is figuring out where we're at, where we need to go, and also creating and supporting humans that are also in this journey together to understand how we may handle different situations based on what we know and what we've experienced. With that, I will say thank you so much for your time today. Please like and subscribe to our show. Give us a rating. Also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and keep the emails coming to accidentalexperts@gmail.com with topic suggestions for future shows. With that, I will say have a wonderful day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.